I pulled my camera bag higher on my shoulder as Kevin's car crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway. 2 hours of winding backwoods roads had led us here, to what should have been a crumbling ruin. Instead, the Blackwood estate rose before us like something from a postcard, every detail sharp and intact. "This can't be right," Sarah said from the passenger seat, checking her phone against the GPS coordinates I'd given her weeks ago. But it was right. I'd cross-referenced 3 different urban exploration forums and spent countless nights researching this place. The Victorian mansion stood exactly where it should, its wraparound porch pristine, shutters perfectly aligned, not a single broken window or missing shingle visible. David whistled low from behind me. You sure this place is abandoned?" I stepped out of the car, my boots finding solid gravel instead of the overgrown weeds I'd expected. The grounds stretched out in manicured perfection, trimmed hedges, weed-free flower beds, grass cut to an even height. My stomach twisted. Abandoned properties didn't maintain themselves. "The forums all said the same thing," I said, pulling my camera from its bag. "Family disappeared in 1987. House has been empty ever since." Kevin shut off the engine, and the silence hit us immediately. Not the normal quiet of countryside, something deeper. I'd photographed dozens of abandoned buildings, and they always had sounds. Settling wood, wind through broken glass, birds nesting in the eaves. Here, nothing. Even the trees around the property seemed to hold their breath. "Okay, that's weird," Kevin muttered, scanning the tree line. "Where are all the birds?" I raised my camera and started shooting the exterior. Through the viewfinder, the mansion looked even more impossible. The white paint gleamed like it had been applied yesterday. Every decorative piece of gingerbread trim was intact, every porch rail straight and unbowed. The front door's stained glass panels caught the afternoon light without a crack between them. Sarah walked a slow circle around the car, her notebook already out. The research said the Blackwood family owned a manufacturing business, made high-end mannequins for department stores. "Rich people stuff," David said, pulling his lock-picking kit from his jacket. "That explains the fancy house." He jogged up the porch steps, examining the front door's hardware. I kept shooting, trying to capture the wrongness I felt but couldn't name. The mansion was beautiful, perfectly preserved, exactly what urban explorers dreamed of finding. So why did my hands shake every time I adjusted the camera settings? "Got it," David called out. The lock clicked open with barely any effort. Weird. That was way too easy for a deadbolt this old. The front door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a foyer that made us all stop walking. Hardwood floors gleamed without a scuff mark. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, every piece intact and dust-free. An ornate staircase curved upward, its banister polished to a mirror shine. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered. I stepped inside, my camera forgotten for a moment. The air felt wrong. Too clean, too still, like being inside a museum after hours. Fresh wallpaper lined the walls in deep burgundy and gold patterns. No peeling edges, no water stains, no signs that 30-plus years had passed. Kevin hesitated at the threshold. "Guys, maybe we should—" "Look at this," David interrupted, pointing to a side table near the stairs. Sarah reached it first, her face going pale. "These newspapers are from October 1987. She held up the Savannah Morning News, its pages crisp and white as if they'd been delivered that morning. The headline read, "Local business family reported missing." I moved closer, photographing the paper over her shoulder. "Check the date," I said. "October 15th, 1987. Sarah's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "This should be yellow and falling apart." David pushed deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. We followed him through a formal dining room where place settings sat ready for dinner, crystal glasses positioned precisely at each spot. No dust anywhere, no cobwebs in the corners. The room looked like someone had stepped out for a moment and would return any second. I raised my camera again, documenting everything. Through the lens, the preservation became even more disturbing. Every surface was clean, every object in its proper place. A grandfather clock in the corner still showed the correct time. "The wallpaper isn't even faded," Sarah said, running her finger along the wall. "This should be sun-bleached and peeling." Kevin stayed close to the doorway, looking over his shoulder every few seconds. "This feels wrong, really wrong." I couldn't argue with him. The house felt like a held breath, like something waiting. The afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that should have been grimy or broken, illuminating rooms that should have been thick with dust and debris. Instead, everything looked ready for immediate occupancy. David's voice carried from the parlor. "You guys need to see this." We found him standing in front of a fireplace mantel lined with family photographs. The images showed a well-dressed family from the 1980s. Parents and a young woman with dark hair, all smiling at formal events and family gatherings. "The Blackwoods," I said, photographing each frame. "They look so normal." "Normal families don't just vanish," Sarah said, studying the faces in the photos. I moved through the parlor, shooting everything. A book lay open on a side table, reading glasses folded beside it. A teacup sat on a coaster, as if someone had just taken a sip. Personal belongings scattered throughout the room told a story of interrupted daily life, but everything remained perfectly preserved. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, making us all jump. Kevin backed toward the door. "Okay, that's it. Clocks in abandoned houses don't keep time." But I couldn't stop photographing. Each image revealed more impossible details. Fresh flowers in a vase that should have been dead for decades. Magazines fanned on coffee tables with pages that hadn't yellowed. Even the carpet looked recently vacuumed. "We need to explore the upper floors," I said, lowering my camera. Sarah nodded, though she looked as unsettled as Kevin. "If we're going to document this place, we should be thorough." David was already heading for the staircase. Whatever happened here, they left in a hurry. Look around. Dinner plates still set, personal stuff everywhere. Something made them run. I took one last shot of the parlor, trying to capture the way the afternoon light fell across surfaces that should have been covered in 30 years of dust and decay. The house felt like it was watching us, waiting to see what we'd do next. Every instinct told me we should leave, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Not yet, anyway. My boots found the polished wooden steps of the grand staircase as David led the way up, his footsteps echoing in the mansion's unnatural quiet. 30 minutes of exploring the ground floor had left us all rattled, though David still maintained his casual attitude about the impossibly preserved house. "We should split up to cover more ground," David said when we reached the second-floor landing. "Sarah, you and Kevin take the bedrooms on the left. Em and I will check out this hallway." The second floor stretched before us with the same unsettling perfection as the rest of the house. Burgundy carpet runners lined the corridor without a single worn spot, and brass fixtures gleamed as if they'd been polished yesterday. I raised my camera, documenting the pristine condition of everything we passed. Sarah nodded and headed toward the bedrooms with Kevin, who kept glancing back at us like he didn't want to separate from the group. I couldn't blame him. The house felt like it was listening to our every move. David strode down the hallway ahead of me, testing door handles as he went. Most opened easily, revealing bedrooms with beds still made, clothes hanging in closets, personal items scattered on dressing tables, everything frozen in time from 1987. I photographed each room quickly, trying to capture the eerie preservation while fighting the growing knot in my stomach. "Check this out," David called from the end of the corridor. He stood in front of a door that looked different from the others, heavier, with more ornate carving around the frame. When he turned the handle, it opened with a soft click that seemed too loud in the silence. I followed him through the doorway and stopped completely. The room stretched before us, easily the largest on the second floor, and it was filled with mannequins, over 50 of them, arranged throughout the space in various poses like guests at some frozen party. My camera hung forgotten around my neck as I stared at the display. These weren't department store mannequins. Each figure was crafted with extraordinary detail that made my skin crawl. The skin textures looked real. I could see pores, subtle color variations, even tiny imperfections that made them appear human. Their hair was styled individually, some in elaborate updos, others flowing loose, all looking like it had just been brushed. The clothing ranged from formal gowns to casual wear, spanning different decades but all expensive and perfectly fitted. "Holy hell," David said, walking between the figures. "This is like a creepy museum." I forced myself to move deeper into the room, raising my camera again. Through the viewfinder, the mannequins looked even more disturbing. Their eyes seemed to follow the camera's movement, though I knew that was just an optical illusion. Had to be. The details were incredible and wrong at the same time. A male figure near the window wore a perfectly tailored suit, his plastic hands positioned as if he'd been caught mid-gesture. A woman in a 1960s cocktail dress stood with one hip cocked, her painted lips curved in a slight smile that looked too real. Each face was unique, not the generic features of store mannequins, but individual expressions that suggested real personalities. "Look at the craftsmanship," I said, focusing on a mannequin dressed in riding attire. "Someone spent serious time on each of these." David was examining a group of figures arranged around what looked like a dinner party scene. Rich people and their weird hobbies, right? Though I gotta admit, these are pretty impressive. He made a joke about inviting them downstairs for dinner, but I barely heard him. My attention had locked onto a figure near the center of the room. A female mannequin with dark hair stood slightly apart from the others, wearing a yellow dress that looked like it belonged in the 1980s. Her pose was different too, while the other figures seemed caught in natural moments. This one stood perfectly straight, arms at her sides, facing toward the door as if greeting visitors. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as I stared at her. The yellow dress was beautiful, made of some kind of silk that caught the light, but something about the way she wore it made my chest tighten. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, styled in a way that looked both vintage and timeless. But it was her face that made me step back instinctively. The mannequin's features were more detailed than any of the others. Every line was perfect, from the arch of her eyebrows to the shape of her lips. Her eyes, painted in realistic blue, seemed to stare directly at me no matter where I moved in the room. Not the blank stare of a typical mannequin, but something that felt intentional and focused. I lifted my camera to photograph her, but my hands shook enough that I had to lower it again. The sense of dread radiating from that figure was overwhelming, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. "Em, you okay?" David's voice seemed to come from far away. "Yeah," I managed, though my voice sounded strange. "Just, the detail on this one is incredible." David walked over to look at the dark-haired mannequin. "Huh. She does look different from the others. More, I don't know, personal. Like someone really cared about getting her exactly right." Before I could respond, footsteps in the hallway announced Sarah and Kevin's arrival. They appeared in the doorway and both stopped dead. "What the hell?" Sarah breathed. Kevin stayed in the doorway, his face going pale. "Guys, this is seriously messed up. Why would anyone keep this many mannequins in their house?" "The family business," I said, finally managing to raise my camera again. "They manufactured mannequins for department stores. This must have been like a showroom." Sarah moved cautiously between the figures, her notebook out but forgotten in her hand. "These aren't normal store mannequins. Look at the faces. They're all different, individual. Kevin hadn't moved from the doorway. I don't care what they are. This room makes me want to crawl out of my skin. Can we please finish up and get out of here? I understood his reaction completely. The mannequins created an atmosphere that felt wrong on a fundamental level. Too lifelike, too detailed, too much like being surrounded by people who couldn't move or speak but were somehow still present. The silence in the room felt heavier than in the rest of the house, as if 50 pairs of artificial lungs had stopped breathing at once. But I couldn't stop photographing. Each figure told a story about craftsmanship and artistry that went far beyond commercial mannequin production. Someone had poured incredible skill and attention into creating these figures, and despite my growing unease, I needed to document that level of detail. The dark-haired mannequin in the yellow dress remained my primary focus, though. Every time I looked away to photograph another figure, I felt drawn back to her. She stood like a centerpiece, the other mannequins arranged in a rough circle around her position. The queen of this frozen court. "We should head back downstairs," Kevin said, his voice tight with anxiety. "This place is getting to me." Sarah was examining the clothing on several figures. "These outfits are museum quality, hand-tailored, expensive fabrics. Whoever owned this collection had serious money." David had moved to the windows, checking the view of the grounds below. "At least we know why the house is so big. You'd need serious space to store this many figures." I took one final photograph of the yellow-dressed mannequin, forcing myself to meet her painted gaze through the camera lens. The shot felt important somehow, like evidence I might need later. When I lowered the camera, she seemed to be looking directly at me with an expression that was no longer welcoming. It was possessive. I kept my camera raised, moving between the mannequins in systematic rows, documenting each figure from multiple angles. 20 minutes had passed since we'd first entered this room, and while the others had grown restless, I couldn't stop photographing. The craftsmanship demanded proper documentation, even though every shot made my skin crawl a little more. Kevin had retreated to the hallway, claiming he needed fresh air, though we all knew the entire house felt suffocating. Sarah moved through the figures with her notebook, jotting down observations about clothing styles and construction techniques. David wandered the room's perimeter, examining walls and baseboards with the focused attention he usually reserved for finding hidden entrances. "The detail work is incredible," Sarah said, studying the hair on a mannequin dressed in 1970s formal wear. "Each strand looks individually placed." I lowered my camera to check the shot count. Almost 200 photos of this room alone. Through the viewfinder, the mannequins appeared frozen in conversation, but looking at them directly created the unsettling impression they'd been caught mid-movement, like a game of freeze tag, where everyone had stopped at once. David's voice carried from near the doorway. "Hey, come look at this." He knelt beside the main staircase where it met the floor, running his hands along the baseboard. What I'd assumed was decorative molding revealed itself as something else entirely when he pressed against a specific section. A soft click echoed through the room, and a section of the wall swung inward. "Hidden door," he announced, grinning like he'd won a prize. I knew something was off about this wall. The proportions didn't match the exterior. The opening led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness below the main floor. Cool air drifted up from the basement, carrying scents of wood polish and something chemical I couldn't identify. David pulled out his phone's flashlight and aimed the beam down the steps. "Should we check it out?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd already decided. Kevin appeared in the doorway, saw the hidden entrance, and shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. This house is already weird enough without exploring secret basements." But Sarah was already moving toward the stairs. "If we're documenting this place, we need to see everything." I followed her to the opening and peered down. The staircase looked solid, with wooden steps that matched the house's overall construction quality. My camera hung around my neck, and I realized I wanted to photograph whatever lay below, despite the growing knot in my stomach. 5 minutes, I said. Just enough to see what's down there. David descended first, his phone light revealing stone walls and what looked like a larger space at the bottom. Sarah followed, then me, with Kevin reluctantly bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved underground, and the chemical smell grew stronger. The basement stretched before us like a workshop frozen in time. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools I didn't recognize, bottles of liquids in various colors, and what looked like molds for creating body parts. Mannequin torsos hung from ceiling hooks in different stages of completion. Some were merely rough forms, while others had been painted and detailed to lifelike perfection. "It's a manufacturing facility," I said, raising my camera to document the space. "The family didn't just sell mannequins. They made them here." The workshop explained the mansion's size and the quality of the figures upstairs. This wasn't a hobby or side business, but a serious operation that had produced dozens, maybe hundreds of custom figures. Workstations held specialized equipment for molding faces, styling hair, and creating clothing patterns. Even abandoned for 30 years, the organization suggested skilled craftspeople who took pride in their work. David moved between the workbenches, examining tools and materials. "This stuff looks expensive. Professional-grade equipment." "Look at this," Sarah called from the workshop's far corner. We moved toward her voice, navigating around hanging figures and work-in-progress mannequins. Sarah stood frozen beside a workbench where a completed figure sat upright, as if waiting for final inspection. My breath caught. The mannequin looked exactly like me. Same blonde hair styled in waves that matched how I wore mine today. Same facial structure, from the shape of my nose to the curve of my jawline. Same blue eyes that seemed to stare directly at me with unsettling focus. The figure wore jeans and a burgundy sweater identical to my current outfit, down to the small tear on the left sleeve I'd gotten last week. I backed away instinctively, my camera forgotten as I stared at my own face rendered in plastic and paint. The resemblance wasn't approximate or vaguely similar. It was exact, like someone had studied me for weeks to capture every detail perfectly. "What the hell?" Kevin said, his voice high with panic. "Why is there a mannequin that looks exactly like Emily?" David moved closer to examine the figure, checking for manufacturing tags or identifying marks. "Blackwood Artisan Figures," he read from a small label attached to the base. "Custom order, completed October 1987. "That doesn't make sense," Sarah said, consulting her notebook. "Emily wasn't even born in 1987. But there it sat, my face staring back at me with painted eyes that tracked my movement no matter where I positioned myself. The clothes weren't just similar, they were identical, including details like the small pin on my sweater collar that I'd bought just last month. Kevin found a filing cabinet and pulled out employee records with shaking hands. "Listen to this. Blackwood Artisan Figures specialized in creating custom mannequins for wealthy clients who wanted figures resembling specific people for personal collections, theater productions, or memorial purposes." "Memorial purposes," Sarah repeated. "That's disturbing." I forced myself to raise my camera and photograph the mannequin that wore my face. The action felt wrong, like documenting evidence of my own death, but I needed proof of this impossible discovery. Through the viewfinder, the resemblance became even more unsettling. Every feature matched perfectly, as if someone had access to detailed photographs or had studied me in person. The basement felt colder than the upper floors, and as I moved around the workshop taking pictures, I noticed other mannequins seemed to have changed positions since we'd entered. Figures that had been facing workbenches now turned toward us. Arms that hung at sides now extended slightly, as if reaching. The movements were subtle enough that I couldn't be certain they'd actually moved, but the overall arrangement felt different. "We need to leave," I said, backing toward the staircase. "Right now." Kevin was already halfway up the steps. Finally, someone making sense. But I couldn't stop staring at the mannequin with my face. Its blue eyes seemed to follow my retreat, and I had the distinct impression it wanted to say something. The painted lips looked poised to speak, frozen mid-sentence in whatever conversation it had been having when we interrupted. Sarah gathered her notebook and started up the stairs. David took one last look around the workshop before following, but I remained rooted in place, unable to break eye contact with my plastic double. Every figure in the basement watched us leave. I felt their artificial gazes tracking our movement, dozens of painted eyes following our retreat up the narrow staircase. The mannequin with my face maintained its stare longest, its expression shifting from welcoming to something that looked almost possessive. We climbed back into the main floor's relative warmth, but the basement's chill seemed to follow us. David pressed the hidden panel closed, but I could still feel the workshop's presence below our feet, filled with watching figures that knew we'd discovered their secret. The house felt different now. What had seemed like impossible preservation now revealed itself as something more deliberate. The Blackwood family hadn't just disappeared. They'd left behind a collection that defied explanation, including a figure that shouldn't exist wearing my face and my clothes. I needed to get out of here before I understood what that meant. I packed my camera equipment with hands that still shook from what we'd discovered in the basement. An hour had passed since we'd climbed back up from that workshop, but I couldn't stop thinking about the mannequin with my face. David had sealed the hidden door, Sarah had closed her notebook, and Kevin had practically sprinted for the main entrance, but I needed to document the mansion's exterior one more time before we left. My camera bag felt heavier as I walked back toward the house, though I knew that was just my nerves. The afternoon light had shifted since our arrival, casting longer shadows across the pristine grounds. I raised my camera and started shooting the wraparound porch, the perfect gingerbread trim, the stained glass panels that still caught the light without a single crack. "Em, come on," Kevin called from where he stood beside his car. "We should get going before it gets dark." I lowered my camera and looked up at the second-floor windows. Something made me pause. The mannequin room's main window faced the front of the house, and through the glass I could see figures silhouetted against the interior light. "David," I said, walking closer to the car but keeping my eyes on the windows. "Look at the second floor." He glanced up, shading his eyes with his hand. "What about it?" "The mannequins. They're facing the windows now." When we'd left that room, most of the figures had been arranged in conversation groups or positioned to showcase their clothing. Now, several stood directly at the windows, turned outward like they were watching the front yard. The dark-haired mannequin in the yellow dress stood at the center window, perfectly framed by the glass. Sarah followed our gaze and made an irritated sound. "You're being paranoid. Mannequins don't move themselves." But I knew what I'd seen. I raised my camera and used the zoom lens to get a clearer view of the window display. Through the magnified image, the details became unmistakable. At least 6 figures now faced outward, their painted eyes directed toward our group. The yellow-dressed mannequin stood front and center, her dark hair framing her face as she appeared to stare directly at me through the camera lens. "They moved," I said, lowering the camera. "I'm not imagining this." David squinted at the windows again. "You know what? You might be right. That blonde one in the blue dress was definitely facing the other direction when we were up there." Kevin was already climbing into the driver's seat. "I don't care if they did the cha-cha. Can we please leave now?" I took a few more shots of the windows, though my hands shook enough that I had to brace against the car to keep the camera steady. Each photo captured the same unsettling arrangement. Mannequins positioned like an audience watching a performance, with the dark-haired figure as their focal point. The drive back to Savannah stretched ahead of us like an escape route. I climbed into the passenger seat while Sarah and David settled in the back, already discussing the mansion's history and the workshop discovery. Kevin started the engine, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders as we pulled away from the circular driveway. but I couldn't stop myself from checking the side mirror as we reached the main road. The mansion remained visible through the trees, its windows gleaming in the late afternoon light. The second-floor display looked the same. Figures arranged at the glass like they were waving goodbye. Kevin navigated the winding back roads we'd taken to reach the estate, and I tried to focus on the conversation happening behind me. Sarah was reading from her notebook about the Blackwood family's manufacturing business, while David speculated about the workshop's specialized equipment. Their voices felt distant, though, like they were talking underwater. I kept checking the mirrors. Not for the mansion, we'd left that far behind, but for something I couldn't name. The forest pressed close on both sides of the road, and my peripheral vision caught constant movement that turned out to be nothing more than shifting branches or shadows between trees. The craftsmanship really was incredible, Sarah was saying. Those weren't mass-produced store figures. Each one was individually created. Including the one that looked exactly like Emily, David added. That's the part I can't wrap my head around. How does someone make a perfect replica of a person who wasn't even born yet? I didn't want to think about that mannequin anymore. The memory of its painted blue eyes made my stomach clench, and I forced myself to watch the road ahead instead of the mirrors. Kevin drove steadily through the twisting route, and gradually the dense forest gave way to more open farmland. The 2-hour drive felt longer than our morning trip. Maybe because we were all processing what we'd seen, or maybe because the afternoon shadows made everything look different. I found myself studying every building we passed, every person walking along the roadside, every vehicle in the opposite lane. By the time we reached the outskirts of Savannah, the sun had dropped low enough to require Kevin to flip down his visor. I felt better seeing familiar landmarks, gas stations I recognized, strip malls I'd photographed for client projects, the suburban sprawl that meant civilization and normalcy. We were stopped at a red light near the city limits when I saw her. A woman in a yellow dress stood at the bus stop on the corner, her dark hair visible in my peripheral vision. My head turned automatically toward the figure, but when I looked directly at the bus stop, only an elderly man in a gray jacket waited there, checking his watch. The light changed, and Kevin drove through the intersection. I twisted in my seat to look back, but the bus stop was empty now. The elderly man had disappeared too, though no bus had arrived to pick him up. "You okay?" Kevin asked, noticing my movement. "Yeah," I said, settling back into my seat. "Just thought I saw someone I knew." But my chest felt tight, and I couldn't shake the image of that yellow dress from my mind. The same shade, the same style, the same dark hair. Just like the mannequin in the mansion's upstairs room. I convinced myself it was stress. We'd spent hours in that impossible house, discovered a workshop full of disturbingly lifelike figures, and found a mannequin that wore my face. Of course, my brain was playing tricks on me. Anyone would see things that weren't there after an experience like that. Kevin dropped David and Sarah off at their respective apartments before driving me to my downtown loft. The familiar streets of Savannah's historic district felt comforting after the isolation of the Blackwood estate. Tourists walked the sidewalks, restaurants glowed with warm light, and everything looked exactly as it should in a normal city on a normal evening. "Thanks for driving," I said as Kevin pulled up to my building. "No problem. But Em, maybe don't look at those photos tonight. Give yourself a break from thinking about that place." Good advice, but I knew I wouldn't follow it. I needed to see what my camera had captured, needed to document everything properly. That's what I did. I found interesting places and photographed them. The Blackwood mansion just happened to be more interesting than most. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The familiar space with its exposed brick walls and tall windows should have been reassuring, but something felt off. The air seemed too still, like it had been undisturbed for longer than the 8 hours I'd been gone. I set my camera bag on the kitchen counter and started transferring the day's photos to my laptop. over 400 images from the mansion, plus the shots I'd taken during our approach and departure. Enough material to keep me busy for hours. The upload process took 15 minutes, and I made coffee while waiting. Normal actions in a normal kitchen. But I kept glancing around the space like I'd forgotten something important. My reflection in the microwave door looked pale and tired, which made sense after the day we'd had. When the photos finished transferring, I settled at my desk with the laptop and started reviewing the images chronologically. The mansion's exterior shots came first. The impossible perfection of the grounds, the pristine condition of every surface, the complete absence of decay or neglect. Then the interior photos. The foyer with its gleaming chandelier. The dining room with place settings ready for guests who would never arrive. The parlor with its family photographs and fresh flowers. Every detail exactly as I remembered it, captured in sharp focus that emphasized how wrong everything was. The second floor images made me pause. Room after room of personal belongings. Beds made with military precision. Clothes hanging in closets like their owners had just stepped out. But as I scrolled through the photos, I noticed something strange. In several shots of the bedroom hallways, mannequins appeared in the background. Not from the main display room, but individual figures standing in doorways or positioned near windows. I remembered photographing empty corridors, but the images showed figures I didn't recall seeing. I scrolled back to the photos from the mannequin room itself. Over 50 figures arranged throughout the space, but their positions looked different from what I remembered. The dark-haired mannequin in the yellow dress stood in various locations depending on the photo, sometimes near the center of the room, sometimes closer to the windows, sometimes almost out of frame. But that was impossible. I'd taken these photos within a 20-minute period. Mannequins don't move between shots, especially not heavy figures that would require significant effort to reposition. I opened the photos in editing software and examined them more closely. The metadata showed exact timestamps for each image, confirming they'd been taken in sequence over a brief period. Yet the yellow-dressed figure appeared in different positions throughout the series, always facing toward the camera no matter where she stood in the room. My coffee had gone cold while I worked, but I didn't notice. The basement photos came next, showing the workshop with its tools and materials, the hanging torsos in various stages of completion, and finally the mannequin that wore my face. Looking at that figure again made my hands shake. The resemblance was perfect, not just similar, but identical in every detail. My hair, my eyes, my facial structure, even the small scar on my chin from a childhood accident. Someone had studied me carefully enough to recreate features that most people wouldn't notice. I scrolled through the exterior photos I'd taken during our departure. The mansion looked the same as always, perfectly preserved, impossibly maintained. But the second-floor windows showed exactly what I'd seen through the zoom lens. Mannequins arranged at the glass facing outward like an audience. The dark-haired figure in yellow stood at the center window in every shot, her painted eyes seeming to track the camera's movement. In the final photo of the series, taken just before we drove away, she appeared to be pressing her hands against the glass. I closed the laptop and pushed back from my desk. My apartment felt too quiet, and the photos had left me more unsettled than the actual visit to the mansion. Seeing the evidence in digital form made everything feel more real, more permanent. The mannequin that looked like me existed. The figures had moved between photos. The yellow-dressed woman had watched us leave. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the memory of that figure at the bus stop. The glimpse of yellow dress and dark hair that had vanished when I looked directly at it. I pulled myself from sleep to the sound of my apartment's heating system running at full blast, yet the air around me felt like I'd left the windows open all night. My breath made small clouds as I sat up in bed, checking the thermostat on my phone app. 72 degrees, same as always, but the cold seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. My laptop still sat open on the desk where I'd left it after reviewing those photos until nearly 3 in the morning. The screen had gone dark, but the memory of those shifting mannequin positions stayed sharp in my mind. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and shuffled to the kitchen, hoping coffee would help shake off both the chill and the lingering unease from yesterday's discoveries. The microwave's digital clock showed 8:47 a.m. as I filled my coffee maker with water. Normal morning routine in my normal apartment, except for the persistent cold that made me keep the blanket wrapped tight around my shoulders. I pressed the brew button and turned toward the microwave to grab a mug from the cabinet above it. Yellow silk caught my eye in the microwave's dark reflection. A dress, dark hair, the suggestion of a figure standing directly behind me in my small kitchen. I spun around fast enough that the blanket fell to the floor. Empty kitchen. Just my coffee maker gurgling to life, morning light streaming through the windows, and the lingering cold that didn't make sense with a functioning heating system. My hands shook as I picked up the blanket. The microwave's surface showed only my own reflection now, pale and tired against the kitchen background. No yellow dress, no dark-haired figure, nothing but the ordinary details of my apartment. I needed to get out of here. An hour later, I sat and grind coffee on Bull Street with my laptop open, and a large latte growing cold beside me. The downtown location stayed busy enough that I could blend in with freelancers and remote workers. Just another person with a computer trying to meet deadlines. My current project involved designing promotional materials for a local art gallery, the kind of straightforward work that usually kept my hands busy and my mind focused. Today, though, I kept glancing up from the screen. Every few minutes, something in my peripheral vision made me look toward the counter, the entrance, or the windows facing the street. A flash of yellow fabric, a glimpse of dark hair, the suggestion of someone watching me from just outside my direct line of sight. But when I turned my head, I saw normal coffee shop customers. A college student in a yellow hoodie reading textbooks. A woman with dark hair typing on her phone. A businessman in a tan coat checking his watch by the window. All perfectly ordinary people going about perfectly ordinary business. I forced myself to focus on the gallery project, adjusting fonts and colors for their upcoming exhibition announcement. The work demanded attention to detail, and normally I could lose myself in the process of making visual elements work together. Instead, I found myself saving the file every few minutes, like I might need to leave suddenly. My phone buzzed with a text from the gallery owner asking about the timeline for final files. I typed back that I'd have everything ready by tomorrow, though concentrating long enough to finish anything felt increasingly difficult. Every movement in my peripheral vision pulled my attention away from the screen. The yellow hoodie student packed up her books and left. A few minutes later, a different woman in a yellow sweater took a table near the back corner. When I looked directly at her, she appeared to be reading a magazine, but something about her posture felt too still, too deliberate. I called David, hoping that talking through yesterday's experience might help settle my nerves. "Hey, Em. How are you feeling after our little adventure?" "Not great, actually. I keep seeing things that aren't there." David's laugh carried easily over the phone. "Yeah, that place definitely got under everyone's skin. Kevin texted me this morning saying he had weird dreams all night." "This isn't dreams, David. I'm seeing the mannequin from the house, the one in the yellow dress." A pause. "You mean you're thinking about it, or you're actually seeing it?" "I'm seeing it, in reflections across the street in the coffee shop where I'm working right now. But when I look directly, it's just normal people wearing yellow clothes." "Em, listen to yourself. You spent hours in a creepy house looking at mannequins, then stayed up late going through photos. Your brain is just processing the experience. It's totally normal to have lingering anxiety after something like that." I wanted to argue, but how could I explain that the sightings felt more real than anything else happening around me? That each glimpse of yellow fabric sent ice through my chest in a way that had nothing to do with my apartment's inexplicable cold? "Maybe you're right," I said instead. "Just give it a few days. Do some normal work, see some normal people, and your head will clear up. That mansion was intense, but it's behind us now." After David hung up, I tried to follow his advice. Normal work, normal coffee shop, normal afternoon in downtown Savannah. I opened a new project file and started sketching layout ideas for a restaurant's updated menu design. Simple, straightforward client work that had nothing to do with abandoned mansions or impossibly preserved mannequins. But the sightings continued. By 3 o'clock, I'd counted at least a dozen instances of yellow fabric or dark hair appearing in my peripheral vision. A woman walking past the window outside. A customer getting in line for coffee. Someone sitting at a corner table just outside my direct field of view. Each time I looked properly, the figure turned out to be a different person engaged in normal activities. The woman walking past the window was checking her phone. The customer in line was ordering a complicated drink. The corner table person was working on their own laptop. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each sighting. Not the casual awareness of being in a public space, but the focused attention of someone studying my every movement. I found myself checking the coffee shop's mirrors, the reflection in my laptop screen, even the surface of my latte for glimpses of yellow silk. My hands had started shaking enough that typing became difficult. I saved my work files and packed up my laptop, deciding to finish the projects at home where I wouldn't be surrounded by so many people and reflective surfaces. But as I walked toward the exit, I caught sight of a figure standing across Bull Street. Dark hair, yellow dress, standing perfectly still among the tourists and locals moving along the sidewalk. Unlike the previous sightings, this one didn't vanish when I looked directly at it. The mannequin from the Blackwood Mansion stood in downtown Savannah, wearing the same silk dress I'd photographed yesterday. Her painted eyes seemed to track my movement as I stopped just inside the coffee shop's doorway. I pulled out my phone and aimed the camera across the street. Through the screen, I saw only normal foot traffic and the historic buildings that lined Bull Street. No yellow dress, no dark-haired figure. Nothing unusual at all. But when I lowered the phone, she was still there. Still watching. Still perfectly motionless while everyone else moved around her. I pushed through the coffee shop's door and stepped onto the sidewalk, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure across the street. A delivery truck passed between us, blocking my view for maybe 3 seconds. When it cleared, the spot where she'd been standing was empty. The walk back to my apartment building took 20 minutes, and I spent every block checking storefronts, doorways, and side streets for another glimpse of yellow silk. Nothing appeared, but the feeling of being observed never faded. Like someone was following just outside my field of vision, matching my pace and staying carefully hidden. Back in my apartment, I made dinner and tried to focus on normal evening activities. I called my parents to check in, watched half an episode of a cooking show, and answered work emails. Ordinary tasks that should have helped restore some sense of normalcy. But the apartment still felt cold, and I couldn't shake the memory of that figure standing across from the coffee shop. Too still, too perfectly positioned, too aware of my presence to be anything normal. By 9 o'clock, I'd given up on productivity and opened my laptop to research the Blackwood family. If I was going to keep seeing things that shouldn't exist, I needed to understand what had happened at that mansion. The search results were sparse, but I found a few local newspaper articles from 1987. "Blackwood Artisan Figures Closes Permanently," read one headline from the Savannah Morning News. The article was brief, explaining that the family business had ended operations after 30 years due to personal circumstances. A follow-up piece from 2 weeks later provided more details. Missing woman search continues. Margaret Blackwood, daughter of the mannequin company's owners, had disappeared from the family estate without explanation. Police found no signs of struggle, no note, and no indication of where she might have gone. The search had been called off after several weeks with no leads. I found one more article dated a month later. Blackwood estate investigation concluded. The police had determined that Margaret Blackwood had likely left voluntarily, possibly due to personal issues that the family declined to discuss publicly, The case was classified as a missing person with no evidence of foul play. But what struck me was the photograph accompanying that final article. A family portrait showing parents and their daughter at some formal event. The daughter had dark hair and wore a yellow dress that looked exactly like the one I'd seen in the mansion's mannequin room. Margaret Blackwood had disappeared in October 1987, the same month those newspapers in the mansion's foyer were dated. The same month, according to the manufacturing label, that the mannequin with my face had been completed. I closed the laptop and checked all my apartment's locks twice before turning off the lights. Tomorrow I'd try to focus on work, avoid mirrors and reflective surfaces, and convince myself that David was right about post-exploration anxiety. But I couldn't escape the feeling that Margaret Blackwood had found a way to leave the mansion after all. 2 days of this had left me barely functional. I sat at my kitchen table with my third cup of coffee that morning, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth that never came, watching the street below through my apartment window. She'd appeared 4 times since I'd gotten up at 6:30. Once standing beside the mailbox across the street, once in the doorway of the antique shop, once reflected in a car window, and once just standing at the bus stop like she belonged there. The dark-haired mannequin in the yellow dress had become a constant presence in my life, appearing every few hours with increasing frequency. What had started as occasional glimpses now happened multiple times each day, and the sightings were getting longer. Instead of vanishing the moment I looked directly at her, she now remained visible for several seconds, sometimes longer, her painted eyes locked on mine before fading away. I'd canceled 3 client appointments yesterday and turned down a potential new project this morning. Concentrating on work had become impossible when I spent every few minutes checking windows, doorways, and corners for yellow silk. My portfolio review with the gallery had been postponed indefinitely after I'd excused myself twice during our meeting to check if someone was standing behind me. Sleep had abandoned me completely. Even with every light in the apartment burning and both deadbolts locked, I could feel her presence in the dark corners where the lamplight didn't quite reach. Last night I'd made it until 3 in the morning before giving up and spending the remaining hours until dawn sitting in my kitchen chair, watching the empty living room for movement. My phone buzzed with another concerned text from David asking if I was feeling better. I'd stopped trying to explain what was happening after Kevin had suggested I talk to a therapist, and Sarah had started using that careful tone people use when they think you're having a breakdown. Maybe I was. The mannequin appeared again while I was reading David's message, standing directly in front of the coffee shop across the street. This time she faced my building instead of standing in profile, and her position looked deliberate, like she wanted me to see her clearly. I set down my phone and moved closer to the window, pressing my face against the glass. She stood perfectly still among the morning foot traffic, her yellow dress bright against the gray sidewalk. Pedestrians walked around her without seeming to notice her presence, and I realized with growing dread that I might be the only person who could see her at all. I grabbed my camera from the counter and aimed it through the window. The viewfinder showed only normal street activity and the coffee shop's entrance. No yellow dress, no dark-haired figure, just people heading to work and tourists starting their day. But when I lowered the camera, she was still there, still watching my window. My hands shook as I tried to take another photo, this time opening the camera app on my phone. The screen showed the same empty sidewalk, but my naked eyes still saw her standing motionless in the morning crowd. The disconnect between what my camera captured and what I could see made my stomach turn. She remained visible for nearly 10 minutes before finally fading away, longer than any previous sighting. The extended encounter left me more shaken than the quick glimpses I'd grown accustomed to. It felt like she was testing how long she could maintain her presence, building up strength for something more substantial. I avoided my bathroom mirror while getting dressed, and kept my eyes focused straight ahead when passing any reflective surface in the apartment. Yesterday, I'd seen her standing behind my shoulder in the microwave door, and the day before she'd appeared in the black computer screen when it had gone to sleep mode. Mirrors and reflections had become traps where she could materialize without warning. By noon, my nerves were completely frayed. I'd jumped at every unexpected sound, checked every shadow twice, and found myself holding my breath each time I turned a corner or entered a new room. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but letting my guard down felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. My doorbell rang just after 1 o'clock, and I practically jumped out of my skin. Through the peephole, I saw Sarah standing in the hallway with a paper bag that smelled like deli sandwiches. "You look terrible," she said when I opened the door, studying my face with obvious concern. "When's the last time you slept?" "Monday night, maybe." I stepped aside to let her in, though having company felt strange after spending so much time watching for supernatural appearances. "Thanks for bringing lunch." Sarah unpacked sandwiches and chips on my kitchen table while I poured 2 glasses of water, normal domestic activity in my normal apartment, except for the persistent cold that made me keep a sweater on despite the heating system running constantly. "Emily, I'm worried about you. David said you've been canceling work appointments and acting paranoid about that mansion we visited." I sat across from her and unwrapped my sandwich, though my appetite had disappeared along with my ability to sleep. "I'm not paranoid. I'm being watched." "By who?" Before I could answer, the mannequin appeared in my hallway, visible through the kitchen doorway. She stood between the bathroom and bedroom doors, wearing the same yellow dress, her dark hair framing her face as she watched us eat lunch. My breath caught, and I pointed toward the hallway. "By her! She's standing right there." Sarah turned to look where I was pointing. "Emily, there's nothing in your hallway. You don't see her? Dark hair, yellow dress, standing right by the bathroom door?" Sarah got up and walked into the hallway, passing directly through the space where the mannequin stood. "There's nobody here. It's just your empty hallway." But I could still see the figure clearly, even with Sarah walking around the same area. The mannequin didn't react to Sarah's presence or movement, remaining perfectly still as my friend checked the bathroom and bedroom before returning to the kitchen. "You're scaring me," Sarah said, settling back into her chair. "Whatever happened at that house really affected you." I pulled out my laptop and opened the photos from our mansion visit, scrolling to the mannequin room images. "Look at these. Look at the background of each shot." Sarah leaned closer as I clicked through the photos, pointing out the dark-haired figure in various positions throughout the series. "See how she moves between shots? She's in different locations in every photo." Those are just mannequins in a display room. Of course, they're positioned throughout the space. But she's facing the camera in every single image. Look at her eyes." Sarah studied the photos more carefully, but her expression remained skeptical. "It's a mannequin. They don't have real eyes or real faces. You're reading emotion into painted features." I scrolled to the basement workshop photos and showed her the mannequin with my face. "What about this one? How do you explain a figure that looks exactly like me, wearing my clothes, completed in 1987? "That's definitely weird," Sarah admitted. "But there has to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone used your photos from social media as reference, or it's just a coincidence that you have similar features to someone else." Her rational explanations made sense, but they didn't account for what I was experiencing every day. I glanced toward the hallway where the yellow-dressed figure still stood watching us, completely invisible to my best friend. "I think you should talk to someone," Sarah continued gently. "A therapist, or maybe your doctor. Spending hours in that creepy house finding that mannequin that looked like you. It was traumatic. It makes sense that your brain is still processing the experience." After Sarah left, promising to check on me again tomorrow, I settled at my computer to research Margaret Blackwood more thoroughly. The initial newspaper articles had provided basic information, but I needed to understand who she was and why she'd disappeared. I found her high school yearbook photo on a genealogy website. Dark hair, blue eyes, a formal smile that looked more painted than genuine. The resemblance to the mannequin in the yellow dress was unmistakable. The same facial structure, the same hair texture, even the same slight tilt to her head. Additional records showed that Margaret had graduated in 1985 and immediately joined the family business instead of attending college. Employee records from the mannequin company indicated she'd worked primarily in design and finishing, responsible for creating facial features and selecting clothing for the custom figures. An archived interview with her father from 1986 revealed more disturbing details. Margaret has always been artistic, he told a trade publication, but she's become particularly interested in the psychological aspects of our work. She believes mannequins can capture more than just physical appearance. They can preserve personality and memory. The article went on to describe Margaret's experimental techniques for creating more lifelike figures, including studying photographs and personal belongings of the people being replicated. She'd developed methods for achieving unprecedented realism in facial expressions and body language. But the most unsettling information came from a police report I found in the online archives. A neighbor had contacted authorities 2 weeks before Margaret's disappearance, concerned about strange activities at the Blackwood estate. The neighbor reported seeing lights in the workshop at all hours, hearing machinery running during the night, and observing Margaret talking to the mannequins in the estate's display rooms. The police had interviewed Margaret's parents, who admitted their daughter had been working obsessively but insisted she was simply dedicated to perfecting her craft. They'd refused to allow officers to speak with Margaret directly, claiming she was too busy with important projects to be disturbed. Margaret had vanished 3 days later. During the same week, the family business had closed permanently. The final police report concluded that she'd likely suffered a psychological breakdown and left the area voluntarily, possibly to escape the pressure of running the family company. But I was beginning to suspect that Margaret had never left the estate at all. The mannequin in the yellow dress wasn't just a figure that resembled her, it was her method of remaining present even after her physical disappearance. Kevin called just as I was closing the research files, and I could see David on the screen as they set up a group video call. Both looked worried, and I knew Sarah had shared her concerns about my mental state. "Hey, Em," Kevin said carefully. "How are you holding up?" "Not great," I admitted. There was no point in pretending everything was normal when I looked as exhausted as I felt. David leaned into view. "Sarah told us you're still having issues related to the mansion. Maybe it's time to talk to a professional about this. You think I'm having a breakdown. We think you went through something stressful and you're having trouble processing it," Kevin said. "There's nothing wrong with getting help." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I was experiencing was real, but how could I explain supernatural harassment to friends who hadn't seen anything unusual? From their perspective, I was a person who'd visited a creepy house and was now claiming to see things that weren't there. "I'll think about it," I said instead, which seemed to satisfy them enough to end the call without pushing harder. But I knew therapy couldn't help with a problem that existed outside the normal world. Margaret Blackwood had found a way to continue existing through her mannequin collection, and she'd formed some kind of connection with me during our visit to the estate. The sightings were getting more frequent and lasting longer because she was growing stronger, more able to manifest in the physical world. The mannequin appeared in my living room while I was making dinner, standing beside the couch like she'd been watching television. This time she remained visible for over 20 minutes, long enough for me to grow accustomed to her presence as a permanent fixture in my apartment. I tried ignoring her, focusing on cooking pasta and warming sauce, but her painted eyes never stopped tracking my movement around the kitchen. When I finally gathered the courage to speak directly to the figure, asking what she wanted from me, she vanished immediately. But I had the distinct feeling she'd heard every word. As darkness fell outside my windows, I prepared for another sleepless night of watching shadows and listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. The additional locks I'd installed provided no real security against something that could appear and disappear at will, and keeping the lights on seemed to make little difference to her ability to manifest. Margaret Blackwood had been obsessed with preserving personality and memory through mannequins, and now I was beginning to understand what that meant. She hadn't just created figures that looked like people. She'd found a way to transfer consciousness into artificial forms, achieving the immortality she'd sought through her family's craftsmanship. The mannequin with my face in the basement workshop wasn't just a replica. It was preparation. I fumbled with my apartment keys at the front door, bags of groceries balanced against my hip. The simple task of buying food had taken 2 hours because I'd kept checking over my shoulder in every aisle, expecting to see yellow silk between the cereal boxes or dark hair reflected in the freezer cases. But the errand had given me a few hours of relatively normal activity, and I felt marginally better as I turned the deadbolt. The living room stopped me cold in the doorway. She stood beside my couch, exactly where I'd seen her the night before, but different now. Solid, real. The yellow dress had weight and texture instead of the translucent quality of previous sightings. Her dark hair moved slightly as if stirred by a breeze that didn't exist in my sealed apartment. Most unsettling of all, her blue eyes tracked my movement as I stepped through the doorway, painted features somehow alive and aware. The grocery bags hit the floor, cans rolling across the hardwood. I'd grown accustomed to glimpses and reflections that vanished when I looked directly at them, but this figure remained completely visible and obviously present in my living space. She looked exactly like the mannequin from the Blackwood Mansion's display room, down to the silk dress and perfectly styled hair, but she existed here in my apartment like any other physical object. I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off her. She didn't move or speak, but her head turned to follow my retreat, the motion smooth and deliberate. Her painted lips curved in what might have been a smile, or might have been the fixed expression of molded features. Either way, it looked wrong in my familiar living room. My keys were still in my hand, purse still slung over my shoulder. I reached behind me for the door handle, found it, and stepped backward into the hallway. The mannequin remained beside my couch, watching through the open doorway as I pulled the door shut and locked it. The drive to my parents' house in Richmond Hill took 45 minutes through evening traffic, and I called them from the car to explain I needed to stay the night. Not the whole truth. I couldn't explain supernatural harassment over the phone, but enough to let them know I was coming and needed help. "Of course, honey," my mom had said when I asked to stay over. "Is everything okay? I'm having some issues with my apartment. Probably nothing serious, but I'd feel better staying somewhere else tonight. We'll make up the guest room. Drive carefully." My childhood home looked exactly the same as always, a 2-story colonial with white shutters, and my mom's carefully maintained flower beds. The porch light was on, and I could see both my parents through the front window, probably watching for my car. Normal domestic scene that felt like safety after the afternoon's encounter. Dad opened the front door before I reached the porch steps. "Emily, what's wrong? You sounded shaken on the phone." "Someone got into my apartment," I said, which was technically true. "I came home and found them inside." Mom appeared behind him, immediately switching into protective mode. "Did you call the police? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. I just left and drove straight here." I followed them into the familiar living room with its comfortable furniture and family photos. I was hoping I could stay tonight, maybe tomorrow too. "Of course," Dad said. "Did they take anything?" I settled onto the couch where I'd spent countless hours during high school, surrounded by the accumulated comfort of 20 years of family life. Nothing was missing. They were just standing there. My parents exchanged a look that I recognized from childhood, the silent communication they'd perfected over decades of marriage. Mom sat beside me while Dad took his usual chair. "Standing there?" Mom asked. "Like they were waiting for you?" Exactly like that, which was more accurate than they could possibly understand. "That's really disturbing," Dad said. Someone who breaks in to steal things is one thing, but someone who enters just to wait around suggests mental instability. You definitely did the right thing by leaving. They insisted I eat dinner while they discussed changing my apartment locks and possibly installing a security system. Normal parental concern about normal criminal activity. I let them plan practical solutions while picking at the leftover chicken and rice Mom heated up for me. Their familiar kitchen felt safe and solid, insulated from whatever had taken up residence in my apartment. After dinner, I asked to sleep in my old bedroom instead of the guest room. Something about returning to the space where I'd felt most secure as a teenager seemed important. Mom found fresh sheets for the twin bed while Dad checked all the doors and windows twice, his own form of ensuring his daughter's safety. My childhood bedroom had been converted to Mom's craft room years ago, but the bed remained along with some of my old furniture and books. I changed into pajamas I'd borrowed from Mom and settled under blankets that smelled like fabric softener and safety. The room felt smaller than I remembered, but comforting in its familiarity. I kept the overhead light on, and the door cracked open, needing to see the hallway and hear any movement in the house. My parents' bedroom was directly across the hall, close enough that I could hear Dad's occasional snoring and the sounds of them settling in for the night. Normal household sounds that should have helped me relax. But even here, surrounded by family and childhood memories, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Not the casual awareness of other people in the house, but the focused attention I'd grown accustomed to over the past few days. Something watching from the hallway shadows, waiting for the household to fall completely asleep. I tried reading one of my old books, but the words wouldn't stick in my mind. Every few minutes I found myself checking the doorway, listening for footsteps, scanning the room for movement. The overhead light created harsh shadows in corners that seemed deeper than they should be, and the partially open door revealed only darkness beyond. At 3 a.m., thirst finally drove me out of bed. I'd been avoiding leaving the room, but my mouth felt like cotton and I needed water. The hallway was dark except for the light spilling from my doorway, and my parents' room was silent. I felt along the wall for the light switch, found it, and illuminated the corridor before heading downstairs. The kitchen light was motion activated, flickering on as I entered the room. I filled a glass from the tap and drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at my parents' backyard. The familiar space looked different in the middle of the night, shadows from the large oak tree creating patterns across the grass. When I turned around, she was standing in the kitchen doorway. The same yellow dress, the same dark hair, the same painted features I'd found in my apartment. But seeing her in my parents' kitchen felt worse than any previous encounter. This was the space where I'd eaten countless family meals, done homework at the counter, argued with my parents about curfew. Her presence here violated something sacred about childhood safety. She stood perfectly still in the doorway, blocking my path back to the stairs. Her painted eyes seemed to reflect the kitchen light, creating the illusion of genuine vision tracking my movement. The yellow silk dress looked almost luminous against the dark hallway behind her. I dropped the water glass, hearing it shatter against the tile floor. The sound echoed through the quiet house, followed immediately by stirring from upstairs as my parents woke. But the mannequin remained motionless in the doorway, undisturbed by the noise or the approaching footsteps. "Emily!" Dad's voice called from the top of the stairs. "Everything okay?" "There's someone in the kitchen," I called back, never taking my eyes off the yellow-dressed figure. Dad's footsteps pounded down the stairs, followed more carefully by Mom. They reached the kitchen within seconds, Dad carrying the baseball bat he kept beside his bed. But when they looked toward the doorway, their faces showed only confusion. "Where?" Dad asked, scanning the empty kitchen doorway. She was standing right there. Yellow dress, dark hair. She was blocking the doorway. Mom moved to my side, crunching over broken glass to reach me. "Honey, there's nobody here. The doorway is empty." I pointed directly at the space where the mannequin stood, still visible to me despite my parents' inability to see her. "She's right there. She's still standing there." Dad walked through the exact spot where the figure appeared to me, his body passing through the space she occupied without any resistance. The mannequin didn't react to his presence or movement, remaining perfectly still as he examined the hallway and checked the front door. "All the locks are secure," he reported. "No signs anyone's been inside." But she was still there, still watching, still blocking the path back to my childhood bedroom. Mom wrapped her arm around my shoulders, guiding me around the broken glass and toward the hallway. "Come on, you can sleep in our room tonight. You've been under a lot of stress lately." I let them lead me upstairs, though I couldn't resist looking back toward the kitchen. The mannequin remained in the doorway until we reached the second floor, finally vanishing as we entered my parents' bedroom. Dad insisted I take his side of the bed while he settled into the reading chair beside the window. Mom arranged extra pillows and made sure I was comfortable before turning off the overhead light, leaving only the bedside lamp burning. "Try to get some sleep," she said gently. "We'll figure out what's going on in the morning." But sleep was impossible. I lay staring at the ceiling while my parents eventually drifted off, listening to the house settle around us. Every creak of the old wooden frame, every whisper of wind against the windows, every normal nighttime sound felt potentially threatening. More than that, I could sense her presence somewhere in the house. Not visible, but nearby, waiting for another opportunity to appear. The feeling of being watched had followed me from my apartment to my childhood home, proving that distance and location meant nothing to whatever was pursuing me. As dawn light began to filter through my parents' bedroom curtains, I understood with absolute certainty that running had been pointless. The mannequin could appear anywhere I went, at any time, in any location. Geographic distance provided no protection from something that existed outside normal physical rules. Margaret Blackwood had formed a connection with me during our visit to the estate, and that link couldn't be broken by simply leaving town or staying with family. She'd followed me to my apartment, to coffee shops, to my parents' house, proving that nowhere was safe from her attention. I was trapped in a relationship I hadn't chosen and couldn't escape, bound to something that had once been human but had become something else entirely through obsession and artificial preservation. The sightings would continue, probably growing more frequent and substantial, until she achieved whatever goal had driven her to seek me out. My normal life had ended the moment we'd discovered that basement workshop. Everything since then had been borrowed time, and now that grace period was over. The mannequin would follow me wherever I went, appear whenever she chose, and continue her patient stalking until I either submitted to whatever she wanted or found a way to sever the connection permanently. And based on everything I'd learned about Margaret Blackwood's obsessive nature, submission seemed more likely than escape. I was no longer living in the normal world. I was existing in Margaret's reality now, where consciousness could inhabit artificial forms and the dead could continue pursuing the living through carefully crafted vessels of wood and paint and silk. My parents left for work that morning with obvious reluctance, Dad kissing my forehead and promising to come home early while Mom packed an extra sandwich in case I got hungry during the day. They'd accepted my explanation about stress and apartment security issues, but I could see the worry in their eyes when they thought I wasn't looking. Normal parental concern about their daughter's mental state, which felt both comforting and inadequate given what I was actually dealing with. I waited until their cars disappeared around the corner before settling at Mom's computer in the living room. The familiar hum of the desktop starting up felt reassuring, and I positioned myself where I could see both the front window and the hallway while I worked. If the mannequin appeared again, I wanted advance warning and multiple escape routes. The internet search for Margaret Blackwood yielded more results when I expanded beyond basic newspaper archives. Court records, business filings, and estate documents painted a picture of a family that had been more troubled than the initial news reports suggested. The Blackwood Artisan Figures Company had been struggling financially for months before Margaret's disappearance, with several custom orders canceled and complaints about delivery delays. But the most revealing information came from police interview transcripts that had been digitized and made available through the county records department. I downloaded the files, noting that the investigators had been far more thorough than the brief newspaper articles indicated. Margaret's mother had told police that her daughter had become obsessively focused on a personal project during the weeks before her disappearance. She'd been working 18-hour days in the basement workshop, refusing to eat regular meals or sleep in her bedroom. When pressed for details about the project, Mrs. Blackwood had explained that Margaret was creating a mannequin replica of herself, claiming it was for a special exhibition. The father's interview revealed even more disturbing information. Margaret had begun talking to the mannequins in the display rooms, having long conversations with figures she'd created. She'd told her parents that the mannequins retained memories and personalities from their subjects, and that her own replica would allow her to continue existing even after death. She kept saying the figures were more permanent than human bodies, Mr. Blackwood had told investigators. She'd spend hours arranging them in different positions, like she was directing a play. Sometimes we'd hear her laughing or arguing with them late at night. I found myself checking the windows and doorway more frequently as I read. The house felt different during the day, emptier and more vulnerable without my parents present. Every shadow seemed deeper, every normal settling sound potentially significant. The most chilling detail came from Margaret's bedroom search. Police had discovered journals filled with detailed notes about consciousness transfer and artificial preservation. She'd written extensively about her belief that personality could be embedded into mannequin figures through careful attention to physical detail and emotional connection during the creation process. One journal entry, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, read, "The figures remember everything about their subjects. Touch, voice, memories, fears, all preserved in the crafted form. Death becomes irrelevant when consciousness can inhabit a perfect replica. The human body is temporary, but art endures forever." Another entry, written just days before she vanished. "I've perfected the process. My own figure is ready, crafted with absolute precision. Every detail of my physical form captured and preserved. When the transfer is complete, I'll be free from the limitations of flesh, permanent and unchanging, like all true art." The final entry was dated the day before Margaret disappeared. "The workshop is prepared. Tomorrow I begin the final phase. The transition from temporary to eternal, from human to permanent. The others watch and wait. They understand what I'm attempting. Soon I'll join them in their perfect preservation." I sat back in the computer chair, my hands shaking slightly. Margaret hadn't just disappeared. She'd deliberately attempted to transfer her consciousness into a mannequin replica of herself. Whether she'd succeeded or died in the attempt, something had clearly survived the process. The figure that had been stalking me wasn't just inspired by Margaret Blackwood. It was Margaret Blackwood, somehow preserved and animated through her obsessive creation. The police report's final pages contained an inventory of items found and missing from the Blackwood estate. Most significantly, Margaret's personal mannequin, the one she'd spent weeks perfecting, had vanished from the workshop along with her. The investigators had concluded that she'd taken the figure with her when she left, possibly as a memento or artistic achievement. But I knew better now. Margaret hadn't taken the mannequin when she left. She'd become the mannequin. Her consciousness had somehow transferred into the artificial form, achieving the immortality she'd sought through her family's craftsmanship. The yellow-dressed figure pursuing me was Margaret's successful transformation from human to permanent art object. That realization led to an even more disturbing understanding about the mannequin we'd found in the basement workshop. The one with my face, wearing my clothes, completed in October 1987. It wasn't just a random replica or strange coincidence. It was preparation. Margaret had somehow known I would visit the estate decades later, and she'd created that figure as an anchor point for her consciousness in the modern world. The mannequin with my face wasn't just a replica. It was a vessel she'd prepared for possession, a way to claim a living person's identity and anchor herself permanently in the physical realm. The constant sightings made sense now. Margaret was testing her ability to manifest through our connection, growing stronger each time she appeared. The mannequin in my apartment, the figure in my parents' kitchen. These were practice runs for something more substantial. She was learning how to inhabit the physical world again, using me as a focal point for her manifestations. I spent the afternoon reading every available document about the case, looking for any mention of how to stop or reverse what Margaret had accomplished. But the police had treated her disappearance as a missing person case, not a supernatural transformation. No one had understood what she'd actually achieved in that basement workshop. By 5 o'clock, my parents still weren't home, and the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. I'd been alone in the house for 8 hours, constantly checking windows and doorways, but seeing no sign of the yellow-dressed figure. The absence felt almost more unsettling than her presence, like she was gathering strength for something more significant. I made a sandwich from Mom's leftover supplies and ate standing at the kitchen counter, unwilling to sit with my back to any doorway. The broken glass from last night's encounter had been cleaned up, but I could still see the spot where the mannequin had stood, blocking my path. The memory made me move to the living room, where I had better sight lines and more escape routes. Just as the sun was setting behind the large oak tree in the backyard, I saw her. She stood beside Mom's flower bed, perfectly motionless among the marigolds and petunias. The yellow dress was clearly visible against the growing shadows, and her dark hair caught the last rays of sunlight. But unlike previous sightings, she wasn't positioned to watch the house. Instead, she faced the back fence, as if examining the boundary of my parents' property. I watched her through the kitchen window for several minutes, waiting for her to vanish as she always did when I looked directly at her. But she remained solid and present, more substantial than I'd ever seen her before. The late afternoon light seemed to pass through her properly, creating realistic shadows on the grass around her feet. Something about her posture suggested invitation rather than threat. She wasn't hiding or lurking. She was standing in plain sight, waiting for me to notice her. When I moved from the kitchen window to the back door, her head turned slightly to track my movement, confirming that she was aware of my presence. I unlocked the back door and stepped onto the porch. The October air was cool against my skin, and I could smell the earthy scent of fallen leaves mixed with Mom's late-season flowers. Normal backyard smells that contrasted sharply with the supernatural figure standing among the landscaping. "What do you want?" I called across the yard. The mannequin didn't respond verbally, but she turned to face me fully. Even at this distance, I could see the painted details of her face clearly. The carefully crafted features that had once belonged to Margaret Blackwood, now serving as her permanent form. Her blue eyes seemed to focus on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I walked down the porch steps and across the grass, stopping about 10 feet away from her. Up close, the craftsmanship was even more impressive and disturbing. Every detail of her face was perfect, from the slight curve of her lips to the individual strands of hair around her forehead. She looked like a person who had been paused mid-breath, frozen, but somehow still alive. "You're Margaret," I said. "You found a way to transfer yourself into the mannequin you created." The figure remained motionless, but something in her painted expression seemed to acknowledge my words. Not a smile exactly, but a subtle shift in the arrangement of her features that suggested satisfaction. "The mannequin in the basement with my face. You made it for yourself, didn't you? You're planning to use it somehow." This time her head tilted slightly to one side, the movement smooth and deliberate. The gesture was almost human, but the perfect stillness between movements reminded me that I was talking to an artificial form animated by obsessive will. I understood then what she wanted from me. The sightings, the constant presence, the growing strength of her manifestations. It was all preparation for possession. Margaret had achieved immortality through artificial preservation, but she was trapped in a form that could only observe and appear. She needed a living person to serve as an anchor in the physical world, someone she could inhabit and control. The mannequin with my face wasn't just a replica. It was a bridge between her artificial existence and my living body. By creating a perfect representation of my physical form, she'd established a connection that would allow her consciousness to inhabit me directly. The constant stalking was her way of strengthening that link, preparing for the moment when she could claim my identity permanently. "I won't let you possess me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The mannequin's painted lips seemed to curve slightly, as if she found my resistance amusing. She remained perfectly still for another moment, then began to fade, her form becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. But the sense of her presence lingered in the backyard, as if she'd left part of herself behind in the space between the flower beds. I stood alone among Mom's marigolds as darkness settled over the neighborhood. Streetlights began to flicker on, and I could hear the distant sounds of families settling in for the evening, televisions, dinner conversations, children being called inside. Normal suburban life continuing around me while I grappled with supernatural harassment that no one else could see or understand. Margaret's disappearance had been successful, but not in the way the police had assumed. She hadn't run away or suffered a breakdown. She'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. Her consciousness now existed independently of human flesh, preserved in the artificial form she'd crafted with obsessive precision. But that achievement had come with limitations. She could appear and observe, but not fully interact with the physical world. That's where I came in. The mannequin with my face had been her solution to that problem, created decades before our visit, as if she'd somehow known I would eventually arrive at the estate. Through that replica, she'd established a supernatural connection that grew stronger with each sighting, each manifestation, each moment I spent aware of her presence. The link between us was permanent now, forged through the combination of her obsessive will and the physical replica bearing my features. Distance meant nothing to someone who existed outside normal physical laws, and time was irrelevant to consciousness that had achieved artificial immortality. I was trapped in Margaret Blackwood's reality now, where the boundaries between art and life had dissolved completely. The normal world still existed around me. My parents would come home from work, neighbors would walk their dogs. Life would continue as always. But I now lived in the overlap between that normalcy and Margaret's transformed existence, where consciousness could inhabit mannequins and the dead could pursue the living through carefully crafted vessels. Walking back toward the house, I understood that my options had been reduced to two possibilities: submit to Margaret's possession and allow her consciousness to claim my body permanently, or find a way to destroy the original mannequin that served as her anchor in the physical world. That figure was still hidden somewhere in the Blackwood mansion, carefully preserved along with everything else in that impossible estate. The constant sightings would continue, probably growing more frequent and substantial as Margaret's connection to me strengthened. She would appear in my apartment, in coffee shops, in my parents' house, in any location where I sought safety or normalcy. The stalking would persist until I either surrendered to her will or found the courage to return to the estate and confront the source of her power directly. As I reached the back porch, I could already feel her watching me from somewhere in the gathering darkness. Not visible this time, but present nonetheless, patient and persistent as only the artificially preserved could be. Margaret Blackwood had waited 37 years for someone like me to visit her estate. She could wait as long as necessary for me to accept the role she'd chosen for me. I was living in a world where reality and nightmare had permanently merged, where the impossible was merely another form of art. and where obsession could transcend death itself through perfect craftsmanship. The normal life I'd known before visiting the Blackwood estate was over, replaced by something far more dangerous and strange. But I wasn't ready to surrender yet.